Welcome to A Life Lived Joyfully, brought to you by the Guadalupe Radio Network. Join us this hour as we explore the call to holiness and the life of virtue. Here's your host, Sarah Soto.
Hey y'all, it's good to be here with you this beautiful Thursday. I am a Catholic wife, mom, and speaker. For more information or to contact me, you can visit my website at sarahsotospeaks.com. In today's show, I have a very special guest. Many of you frequent flyers here on A Life Lived Joyfully have heard members of the Society of Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity, many of my good dear friends, come on the show a number of times. Well, today in the studio, we have the General Priest Servant of the Society of Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity, Father Peter Marsalek. He is a university tennis champion and engineer before he entered the priesthood. He's originally from the Toronto, Canada area, and he received a doctorate in sacred theology, summa cum laude, from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas in Rome. Welcome to the show, Father Peter. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Sarah. Very happy to be with you.
Some of you may think that Father Peter sounds extremely familiar, and that would be because he celebrates very often the 7:30 a.m. Central Mass on Guadalupe Radio Network. So if you start to say, man, I really recognize that voice, that sure sounds familiar, preaching to me when I'm driving to work, that's Father Peter Marsalek. He's here in Corpus Christi at where the Society of Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity, or SOLT for short, is headquartered. And you've been here about 20 years, is that right?
Well, I got here the first time in 2007.
Okay.
I spent 4 years here. Then I did 2 years up at the seminary in Detroit.
Okay.
And then in 2013, I was elected to my current position. So I've been serving in that capacity for the last 11 years.
Wow. And it's a bit different from Canada down here.
Yes, it is. It's this time of year, it's very, very pleasant to be in the warm weather and not have to worry about shoveling snow, although I do feel bad about my parents having to do it at home, so that's the downside.
We did shovel snow here once in the last 20 years, and it didn't fill up a shovel, but we did shovel it in a direction or so. Well, I'm very grateful that you have agreed to come on the show with us. I was just speaking to you earlier about how during the homilies, if people are listening to the Mass, you frequently mention trying to live a virtuous life. And it's been really on my heart lately. I gotta get this guy on the show, and so I'm very grateful for your time. And I think we'll sort of kick it off by, I'm gonna move this closer to me. So we're very quick to celebrate our neighbor Ted because his kid got into Texas Tech, or our coworker Betty, whose granddaughter just passed the bar exam. And we seldom, if ever, hear about someone's child or young adult relative who has, by self-mastery, found a way to, I don't know, stop using crude language, or someone who's, he's such a virtuous young man. That's not a compliment and language we hear very often. But when you think about it, in the Catechism, St. Gregory of Nyssa says that the goal of a virtuous life is to become like God. So you'd think with such a massive Christian population, we'd hear very often about people's attempts and desire to live a virtuous life, but it's almost kind of foreign. And so I've invited you on the show today to sort of help our audience understand more clearly what the role of the virtues is, what it is, and how it's meant to dispose us to the good. I'm very excited to have you on to share a little bit more about that with us today.
Well, thank you, Sarah. That was a beautiful introduction to the topic, and I like the way you framed that in terms of things that people celebrate in terms of the achievement of their children or friends and things of that nature. And it reminds me a little bit, even from my own upbringing. I think a lot of my identity, in a way, was wrapped around playing tennis. And, there's a lot of, I think, a powerful analogy to be made between, sports or music and virtue and what it means to our life, So, for example, to be a good tennis player, you've got to put in a lot of training. You got to have a good coach who kind of shows you the technique of what a forehand looks like, what a backhand looks like, how to serve, how to volley, how to move on the court and have proper footwork. And you receive instruction on the matter, and then you go about trying to apply it. And that's where practice comes in. And you practice, and you have a coach who tells you need to do a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that. And gradually, as you kind of keep growing and becoming more and more perfected in how to do the strokes in a technically proficient way, the next thing you know, you're able to move the ball around the court with different spins, different directions, different speeds. And it gets to a point where you don't have to think about it. It kind of becomes like a second nature. And so it really is a capability that you have. And at
Muscle
that moment,
memory.
muscle memory, as they'd say in sport. And so really you get to a point where you don't have to think anymore, okay, how do I hit a forehand? How do I hit a backhand?
Right.
But you just say, I'd like the ball to go here. I want to hit it with topspin. And you know that in your head. And so your body reacts and does it. Now, of course, unless you're Roger Federer or Rafael Nadal, you don't typically get it to always go where you want to.
Right.
But this is kind of the idea, and the fact is, with sport, we put in a lot of time, into training, and that's, I think, that's what makes your point so salient is really, what technique, practice, coaching, counseling are in sport to develop into being an elite player of some kind. That really is what is meant to be applied in the moral life with virtue. Because virtue is really whereby we're instructed in what is the good to do in a particular situation or in a particular field of life. Now we're in the Lenten season, and so maybe temperance is a virtue that's on people's mind, of fasting and things of this nature. And so, with the virtue of temperance, you kind of learn, okay, I need to moderate my sensory appetites, how much I'm recreating, how many video games I'm playing, how much food I'm eating, how much I'm drinking. All of these natural desires that we have need to be moderated according to a right reason, according with the goal of our life, which is communion with God.
Right.
And so once you're instructed in it, you go about the business of trying to practice it, trying to apply it. And maybe sometimes we fail and we say, okay, I need to get back and try a little bit better to moderate how much I'm drinking or how much I'm resting or whatever it would be. But with practice, and also it's very helpful to have a little bit of coaching or a little bit of counsel or a good friend to be able to encourage. Because that too, is another thing in sport. You never play alone. You're always kind of with a group of people who are pushing one another to try to become as good as can be. And in the Christian life, that's first what parents are supposed to be for their children, but then also friends and others to kind of encourage us to stay down the path of trying to grow in virtue. And then as we acquire virtue and grow in it, for us, it becomes like this habitual disposition that we possess or a capacity that we possess, which we're then able to activate kind of in a moment's notice or in any situation in a variety of different creative ways, because now we possess the ability and we no longer have to fight or we no longer have to resist in doing it, Kind of just to illustrate the point, I remember one of our professors in seminary when he was talking about virtue, he said, imagine two people walk into a variety store. One person's a lifelong kleptomaniac and the other one perfectly possesses the virtue of honesty. And the store clerk has to go to the back, and so the store is completely empty and those two individuals are there. In theory, the opportunity is there to take whatever they would want. The kleptomaniac has to fight and struggle and say, I don't want to do this anymore. I got to resist. I don't want to take anything. I don't want to take anything. And he finally succeeds and he walks out of the store successful and not stealing.
Right.
The honest person, well, they've never stolen anything in their life. They're perfected in saying, hey, what's mine is mine. What's yours belongs to you. I'm not going to take it without some kind of mutual agreement. And they walk out the store as if nothing ever happened and the temptation was brushed aside as nothing.
Right.
And if you were to ask the question, well, which of those two is the more virtuous? The temptation's always to say the first guy because he had to struggle more and he had to fight more for it.
Right.
But the reality is it's the second person who really possesses that virtue. And in the moment when it comes time to be applied, it really is a capacity which he already has within himself inherently. And as a result, he's able to use it in the moment with relative ease,
Right.
And I think that's kind of what virtue is.
So in the scenario where a kleptomaniac is listening to the show right now and it's really hitting home for them, is it possible for them to be at a point where they enter that same variety store and they perfectly have they've perfected the virtue of honesty, and now they are alone in the store because the shopkeep has left, and they brush the temptation off like nothing, and they put, like practicing sports, they put blood, sweat, and tears into fighting and fighting and fighting, and eventually they get to a point where there's no longer that profound wrestling with the desire to steal.
Yeah, no, it's very well stated. I think two things really come into play. The first is, of course, God's grace is for us a great assistance in being able to grow in virtue. Mm-hmm. And we can always count on his assistance as we strive for spiritual perfection. Mm-hmm. And the second aspect of it is, the best way to acquire a virtue is to practice it. Right. And the more we're able to practice it, then eventually it becomes a part of who we are. Mm-hmm. And again, it becomes this capacity that we're able to enable in a moment's notice. So, right. Yeah.
And so like you mentioned, you weren't born able to know exactly what a forehand was or a backhand. It took all this practice, it took all this time. And so the best way to possess a virtue is to practice using it. But there's something that you mentioned there. Obviously, God's going to assist, and that key word "assist" is something I think some of us miss, me especially. God is not going to. He's not a magician. He's not going to wave a wand over you and just eliminate that sin, right? The vice that you struggle with immensely. It takes a lot of work on our part. It's not something. Obviously, if God can do whatever he wants, right? And he certainly is capable of doing that. But there's a lot of work on our part. And I think in secular culture, we want things that come very easily to us, and anything that takes any amount of legwork, we're pretty quick to brush off as, that's for some other guy, for some other chump. I can't put in that kind. Who's got the time, But it really is. I know a lot of people, and I'm sure you do too, who have overcome a tremendous amount, right, of having previously lived in the world and then had this great conversion. And you see these holy people, or you encounter these holy people, they're not born that way. They're formed. And like you said, parents play a huge role in that. Obviously, listening to Guadalupe Radio Network, and getting in all the holy and wonderful radio shows and listening to Mass in the morning helps a lot on that journey. But with all the blood, sweat, and tears that it takes, I think the sort of question is, why would somebody want to reject the ease of? It feels easy, right? It feels easy for some people to just live in vice and to commit sin. If there's no blood, sweat, and tears, I'm fine. I'm very complete. I'm very happy, and quote unquote happy and comfortable where I am. Why would I do all that hard work to be virtuous, like these people on the radio keep saying is so fantastic? What's the, not necessarily the motivation, but why is it so good? Why is it worth all that work, I think? Yeah.
Well, I think the short answer is it's worth all that work because ultimately it's the path to happiness. We were ultimately created by God and created for God, with a destiny and a goal in life to live in communion with the Most Holy Trinity. And to achieve that goal means to become perfected according to our human nature, which really means being perfected in God's truth and in God's love. And really to strive to live a virtuous life and to set out on the path of holiness, that really is where the answer to our desire for deep happiness and fulfillment comes in. And I say deep happiness and fulfillment because, it goes without saying there's always some forms of sensory pleasure or momentary fleeting moments of happiness that people experience even as they pursue vice. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it in the first place. Right. But at the end of the day, sinful things or vicious things, which has the root vice in it, they're always things which at the end leave us feeling divided, miserable, and interiorly unsatisfied. And no matter how much we want to kick and scream against that and say, why is that the case? The simple answer is we didn't make ourselves. God's the one who created us, and he created us for himself. He created us with the freedom that enables us to have the capacity to love and to be able to know truth in our intellect. And because that is part of our human nature and part of who we are as created beings, we don't get to change, what our nature is, what our makeup is, nor do we get to change then what the goal of our life is. Right. And then the means to kind of move in that direction, that's the reason why we do it, because ultimately that's where true happiness and fulfillment are going to come in this life and the next. And I think for most people, and I would say myself included, in our experiences in life, I think precisely we really do experience that reality that sin leaves us feeling unsatisfied and hurt and divided and broken. And when we choose the good, even when it's difficult and challenging to do, even when it requires sacrifice, it does leave us feeling fulfilled and kind of this interior indication given to us by God that that is the path to follow. And both of those things I really believe are imprints that God has placed in our nature to tell you that's the wrong direction. You can go there, but it's not going to lead you to happiness. And conversely, the other way to say, that is the right way, and that's why you experience fulfillment.
Yeah. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about, in a more detailed way, how we experience that fulfillment through specifically the theological and the... Hold on just a minute. The 4 cardinal virtues. We'll talk about some of those differences there and how they play a role in our life just after a short break.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 39,000 feet. We'll turn that seatbelt sign off for you and let you move about the cabin. Looks like we'll have you at the gate in plenty of time for you to get to confession before Mass this evening.
Wouldn't it be great if everyone regularly went to confession? Why not start today? A friendly suggestion from Guadalupe Radio Network.
Hi, this is Dr. David Anders from EWTN's Call to Communion. I believe that the ministry of Catholic radio is one of the greatest tools we have in the church for evangelism today. I hear from people all over the world on a daily basis who have encountered Christ in the Catholic Church for the first time by listening to Catholic radio. Please support the ministry of Catholic radio today. Support Guadalupe Radio Network.
It is here where you'll find the best marriage counselor, greatest healer, wisest teacher, and closest friend. It's a place where you'll escape the chaos of the world and find the lasting peace that only comes from God. Jesus is personally waiting to embrace you now with his divine mercy and healing love. Jesus is calling you home to his sacred heart today.
I need a mercy. I need a Savior.
Welcome back to A Life Lived Joyfully on the Guadalupe Radio Network. Give us a call. The lines are open at 877-757-9424. That's 877-757-9424.
Hey y'all, welcome back. Thanks for joining us here today on A Life Lived Joyfully. In the studio we have Father Peter Marsalek. He's the General Priest Servant of the Society of Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity, and we are talking about the virtues, how the best way to possess them is to practice. I know, folks, it's like, it's Lent. I'm asking you to do work. I know, it's ridiculous. Who let this lady on the radio? It is a lot of tough work to combat the temptation that we have given into, the temptation that we are accustomed to, the sins that we're sort of comfortable with. But now is a beautiful time of year to break the chains that bind us and to try to practice the virtues so that we can grow in holiness and closer in relationship with the Most Holy Trinity, the very purpose for which we were created. So that being said, the Catechism talks about how the virtues allow someone to not only perform this particular good, but to give the best of himself. And don't we want to give the best of ourselves? I know that our listeners are very holy and that you all don't make selfish decisions. I'm specifically talking about me, but we want to give the very, very best of ourselves. And when we sin, especially habitual sin, it kind of does the opposite, doesn't it? When we sin, we reject the good. And additionally, the more we sin, the more difficult it becomes to discern the will of God. Well, gee, Sarah, why do I need to know what the will of God is? Well, it's important to be able to discern God's will for our life so that we can love and serve him, obviously, but it's also how we'll experience the most joy, as Father Peter mentioned earlier. And so what is it about, Father Peter, habitual sin that makes it more difficult to hear the voice of God? I mean, can everyone hear the voice of God? Isn't it that funny feeling, the Jiminy Cricket? Well, I shouldn't do this or I should do that. How do we know, or how does sinning make it more difficult to hear God's call in our lives? And how does rejecting sin and choosing virtue and choosing holiness help us to hear God more clearly? Is it like a tuner that we can turn on and off?
Well, that's a good question. I think every sin essentially is a turning away from God. And, in a way, I guess if you're to make that analogy, the more you're turning your back on someone and moving in a direction away from them, well, of course, it only makes sense that it's going to be more difficult to hear them,
Right,
But in particular with mortal sin, the reason why it's called mortal or deathly is because it does cut off the life of grace within us. It cuts off our communion with God, and therefore requires that we would receive the sacrament of reconciliation, to be forgiven and to be restored in the fullness of our relationship with God. And it's always, I think it's an interesting contrast between vice and virtue, is that vice does leave people enslaved.
Right.
They precisely lose control of their life, and they lose their personal freedom, and they become stuck in a habitual pattern of action. Whereas with virtue, it's precisely the opposite. You're not habitually stuck, but rather you're habitually free, and you're able to creatively choose what is God asking me to do in the different situations in my life to be able to live faith, hope, and charity. Another kind of example I like to give that way that shows it would be, if you're a piano player and you are learning how to play the piano and you're mastering it and you're becoming more and more proficient, the person who really is like a maestro at the piano, who if you put any sheet of music in front of them, they bind themselves to playing the notes on the page in order to make a beautiful sound. And in the proficiency which they acquire, they're now ultimately free for playing whatever music they would want to be able to do.
Right.
For the person who doesn't commit to go down the road of excellence, or to go down the road of acting according to the truth about the good to be done and the evil to be rejected, they would be kind of akin to the person who sits at the piano and says, well, there's 88 keys here, I can whack away at them in any order I want to, and I'm going to bang away. But that person's really not free for making beautiful music.
Yeah.
They're going to be stuck as a banger for the rest of their life until they stop and say, hey, what is the point of playing the piano? What is making beautiful music? How can I have my fingers going in concert with one another in the right timing and sequence to be able to actually play music and to be able to grow in proficiency? And that's kind of another indication of why we have these internal indicators that God has placed in our nature to say this is the right road to take and this one isn't. Because when you choose sin and vice, you get stuck, you become enslaved, and you precisely lose freedom, and at that point we don't feel very good about ourselves. Whereas when you grow in virtue and your capacity to do good and to be able to be creative and positive in the things that you do in life, and exercising in particular faith, hope, and charity, well, then your life really becomes like a beautiful song, and you really experience a growth in freedom, where now you say, with God's help, I think I can do anything, not because of my own skills or talents, but precisely because of my relationship with God and what He's given to me. And that I think is really another fundamental mark which tells us virtue's the way to go and vice is definitely not the way to go.
Yeah. So two things that I want. Well, there's so many things. There's always so many things, but did you hear me playing piano when you walked up to the door? Is that why you used that analogy? I am definitely the type to walk by and hit the loudest. Was it loudest? Deepest to the highest? See, that's how bad I am. Yes, I'm like, gosh, did he hear me bang on the piano before he walked in here? Now, that's a really good analogy. It makes it so easy to understand that, yeah, I mean, we might be, the other day in a homily, you said that the root of the word temptation is to try, right? The evil one can tempt us. Hey, just try what it's like to be married. You're not married, right, to your boyfriend or girlfriend, but just try it out because, right, I mean, ultimately, like, desire is a good, right? It's a good. And so we might be chasing this desire that's, disordered, right, outside of marriage. But ultimately, it's this, just try it out, just see how it is. But you can't, right? You can't try out marriage. That's not how it works. And so at the end of the day, that we think we're so free because we're trying, right? All these things, what the world has to offer, so many things. You can try it out. Just try it. It's not going to hurt anybody, just a little bit. But at the end of the day, we sound like me playing the piano, which is really, really rough. And don't we want to be free to have that chorus of beautiful music in our lives? We want that freedom, and it's certainly not being a slave, right? Being bound by the ugly, ugly nature of sin. Which, and my other point is, you mentioned. So there's a lot of different virtues, and I would like to talk about all of them, but I have to. If you were listening to the radio mass, I think it was Tuesday this week. All my days are mixed up. But I do want to talk about patience because it's Lent and we're human, so it's always a good thing. But you mentioned something about humility. And it was one of the best analogies I've ever heard about humility. And it was, I say a lot and remind myself a lot that comparison is the thief of joy, right? And so we're like, look at so-and-so, they've got a bigger house than us. And look at so-and-so, they've got all these cars or whatever ridiculous thing, So especially during the season of Lent, when we feel bound and trapped by comparing ourselves, right? And thinking that we're better than other people, how can we look to the virtue of humility? And I mean, the world tells us humility means something very different than what it really does. I think just in my experience, my sister is really into sports, and for her, humility is not bragging about her skill. And the truth is, she's extremely skilled, right? And that's a gift. And so that's just truth. Like our good mutual friend, Deacon Bernie, says when he talks about how intelligent he is, he's humility is rooted in truth, he says, and so he's not bragging. It's so much more than avoiding bragging. Can you speak a little bit to the virtue of humility for us?
Yes. Yeah. I always like kind of a, simple definition of humility that, humility understands our littleness next to the greatness of God, and it's interesting when you say, we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to one another, and that's absolutely true. The only one who we should be comparing ourselves to is Jesus Christ, because he is the full measure of what we are called to live and who we are called to become. He's the full measure of holiness, and he's ultimately the one who we're called to compare ourselves to. And when we do it, of course, we know we're always going to come short. That it should not be news to anyone who is listening. So I think humility, understanding our littleness next to the greatness of God, I think in the first place means we know that whatever we have, which is good about us, whatever natural talents we have, whatever our abilities we have, none of it we have acquired of our own brilliance to begin with. All of it is a gift from God, as is the very life that we possess. And therefore, even from that perspective, we have to say, well, God is the origin of anything that I have in my life. And yeah, maybe I work hard to become good at something or whatever, but at the end of the day, without God, I would have nothing to play with even to begin with. Right. So that's the first thing, is that really it does originate in him. And the other part would be when we kind of keep that perspective of rooting our gifts and talents in God, and when we look at the full measure of what we're striving to become in Jesus Christ, we constantly see too that we are a work in progress. And I think that part of it as well, it keeps us recognizing we need God's help for everything we do. And what humility is really doing for us, it is keeping us grounded in the reality that we are dependent upon God for everything. Because the temptation to be proud and to think I'm self-sufficient, I'm autonomous, look at all the things I can do on my own, I don't need anyone, I can do it all by myself, that's a lie. It's just simply not true. And but it's a temptation which is there. And so humility kind of keeps us really grounded in the fact every day in my life I'm dependent upon God for everything. I always loved St. Thomas Aquinas kind of gave the example. He said, God, he didn't just create us, but every moment of our life he sustains us in our existence. And he said it's like a singer singing. You don't just sing one voice, one note, and then that's it. To be heard perpetually, that voice has to keep singing. And he says this is really what God does in creating the world and creating us, but also in sustaining us. He holds us in our existence at every moment. And when we realize that, we can't help but say, yeah, I mean, next to God, I am nothing. And comparatively, between us, if we really want to go down the road of comparison, it's kind of like, well, what's the point? I think, the example I gave the other day, it'd be like one person standing on a chair and saying, look how much closer to the moon I am than you. It's meaningless. It's nothing. God is the one we're looking for.
Even the smartest person in the world is not much closer to the moon than you are. It's kind of bizarre when you think about it. We'll be back after a short break. Thanks for listening.
This is Dave Palmer. Do you love all that you're learning about the Catholic Church here on the GRN? And are you ready to dive into the deep? If so, join us each Friday afternoon beginning at 1 p.m. Central for Back to the Father on the GRN's Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter pages as we discuss key teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia and their application to our everyday journey through this life and our goal of returning back to the Father. Each Friday at 1 p.m. Central, email backtothefather@grnonline.com for more information.
Many Christians are familiar with the story where the Pharisees bring a woman caught in adultery to Jesus and try to test him for charges against the law of Moses. Jesus had been showing all sorts of mercy that was unusual to them, eating with sinners and tax collectors, driving demons out of Gentiles, and even curing people on the Sabbath. They thought they could trap him, but Jesus bent down and began to write on the ground. We can assume he was writing out their sins. He then said, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And in response, they went away one by one. Jesus then said, "Has no one condemned you? Then neither do I condemn you." But Jesus continues, "Go and sin no more." It's fine for us to meet people where they are at with mercy, but we can't just leave them there. We must help them come to a place free of sin in their lives. This is Matt Maloney from knowthefaith.net.
All my life, I was searching for something that seemed to be just one step away. Perfect soulmate, the ideal job, that big adventure. And just when I thought I found what I was missing, I realized that I was never really fulfilled. Then I discovered what I was searching for was really faith in God and belonging to a church. You can find what you've been searching for too. Come and see at CatholicsComeHome.com.
Welcome back to A Life Lived Joyfully on the Guadalupe Radio Network. Give us a call. The lines are open at 877-757-9424. That's 877-757-9424.
Hey, y'all, remember last week on the show when all of you who called in were on hold because we had a technical error? If you feel like calling in, I promise you won't go on hold. 877-757-9424. Our faithful producer will answer your call. Again, you will not be made to be on hold the whole time. 877-757-9424. If you have a question for Father Peter, he's not available and on this show very often, and he knows what he's talking about, if you couldn't tell. So if you have a question for him, or if you just want to talk somebody up that you know that's very virtuous, not yourself because it's Lent, give us a call at 877-757-9424. So before the break, we were talking about humility. I just have to reiterate, when we use the analogy of one of us standing on a chair and looking at someone standing on the ground next to us and saying, "I'm closer to the moon than you are," I think that's the voice that I imagine that they use. I'm closer. When we think that you talk about, I work with a lot of young adults and teens, and the comparison is, this celebrity that's got all these millions of dollars and all this plastic surgery and all this, and that's what I want to attain, which, obviously that's a whole other show, but they think that they're so much greater, right? And they're in reality, financially, maybe they're standing on a chair and then they're standing on the ground. But yeah, I just really, 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 really love that analogy. But humility is something we all could probably work on. But patience, I don't know why. Maybe there's some historical fact about it. You always hear people say, now patience is a virtue. Patience, well, so is temperance, lady. Why are you telling me that? Why is just patience a virtue? If I had to speculate, I would say it's because it's hard as heck to be patient in traffic. If you've ever driven a vehicle before or anything like that, can you speak to patience, especially during this time of year?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think patience is one of the things that you hear people lamenting about their lack of the most in general. And it could be, patience in relationship, patience with a spouse. And, patience is what we call an allied virtue to the cardinal virtue of perseverance or fortitude. Fortitude is that virtue whereby we persevere in the difficult good to accomplish or in avoiding the evil which is difficult to avoid. But in the case of patience, the reason why it's so challenging and so difficult is because really patience is rooted in suffering. It's like that the word patience comes from the Latin word patire, which means to suffer. I suppose that's why when you're in the hospital, you're called a patient, because you have to wait. You have to wait for your convalescence. You got to recover, and you're there to suffer, and there's not much you can do about it. But when we think of the connection between patience and suffering, automatically that should take our eyes to the cross, because we remember that really Jesus is the one who is most patient with us. He suffered on account of our sins. He suffered in order to save us from our sins. And he endured all the way to the end in manifesting the depths of his love for us and what he was willing to suffer. And in so doing, manifested the depth of his patience with us. And I think to that end, it really reminds us that patience, we need Jesus' help to be able to do it. We need to be reminded when other people are getting on our nerves, whether that's drivers on the road or people in our relationships in life. We need to always remember the patience Jesus exhibited to me is still infinitely more than whatever degree of patience I need to demonstrate to the person who may be irritating me in this moment. Again, it kind of takes us back to the chair, right? And standing on the chair and saying, I need to be so patient with this person. Remember, Jesus was patient for us first. And somebody once pointed out to me, which I thought was a very kind of beautiful phrase, which I've held on to over the years, and that is to say, patience with other people is charity. When we're able to endure the weaknesses, faults, even failings, or even the sinfulness of other people, and endure in our relationship with them, that's really an act of charity. It's an act of love to be patient with them in that regard. Patience with God is faith. And that means when we have to suffer through things in life that are mysterious to us and we don't understand, why am I going through this? What is the point of this? Where is it leading me? That is precisely in the moment where we're called in faith to trust in God and to continue to be patient in those moments. And then finally, patience with ourselves is hope. And there we have to remember, we also acknowledge our own imperfections, our own sinfulness, our own weaknesses. And it can be easy to be discouraged. And it can be easy to say, boy, I don't know if I'm ever going to overcome these challenges that I have. And that's where we need to be patient with ourselves and to be able to suffer through even our own weaknesses and to remember Jesus is our one true hope. And his victory on the cross, his conquering of temptation in the desert, in him we can ultimately find the victory over the things in our life that ail us and that we struggle with. And that really is an expression of hope. And so I always think those are important things. Remember, patience is rooted in suffering, which takes us to the cross. Patience with others is charity. Patience with God is faith. And patience with ourselves is hope.
So not much to unpack there for anyone listening. My goodness. So if patience with others is charity, what if they're really obnoxious? Is it what? I mean, it's like, do you still have to? I think at the end of the day, so I was talking with someone recently who it's a married couple, right? They're sacramentally married, but they're struggling to conceive. It's been a really, really, really long time. And I can see, and they've expressed the temptation to fall into despair. And so, as I'm listening to you talk about the having patience with yourself, to overcome, and having, what did you say? Hope, patience in God is, right. I mean, you have hope. So just to speak to that really specific example, how does somebody who is deeply, deeply longing, right, for children, and they hope that the Lord will bless them with a child. And perhaps if they are not able to conceive and they don't have children naturally, and they don't adopt, how do you think, what's the balance, I think, and not just in that situation, but how do you hold on to hope but find the acceptance to know that what you're hoping for, God might not be God's will? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, it makes sense, and there isn't an easy answer to it, and I think it takes us back to the cross, and to the mystery of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, and even to thinking of our Blessed Mother at the foot of the cross, uniting herself with that sacrifice of Jesus. And I don't know what our Blessed Mother was thinking in that moment, but I'm sure she was in full trust with God. I'm guessing it probably wasn't how she imagined it was going to go in terms of, when she was told she was going to be the mother of God and the mother of Jesus. It must have been an incredibly mysterious and excruciatingly painful moment. But it's also precisely a moment to manifest an incredible trust and an incredible faith in God. And, I think there's something to be said, when God allows us to suffer in particularly deep ways. We remember nobody suffered more than Jesus. Right. And in a sense, the more we suffer, the more we're able to share and participate in his work of redemption and salvation. And it's not, I know it's easier to say that than to do it. And right. It's not kind of a catch-all answer to everything, but at the end of the day, it is, I think, the answer. Right. Is to say, in God's economy, power is manifested in being able to offer ourselves completely in all the circumstances of our life and all the challenges of our life and all the difficulties and all the sufferings. And in some ways, the more we go through, as difficult as it is and as mysterious as it is, it's also an amazing opportunity to unite ourselves and to participate in that work of redemption of Jesus on the cross, whereby he gives us an opportunity to share in his saving mission, and it's an amazing thing, that God saves us, but he also not only allows us to cooperate in terms of our freedom to accept the gift of salvation, but he also allows us to be facilitators and assistants and intercessors to other people on their journey of faith and on their reception of the gift of salvation won by Jesus on the cross, and I think apart from the mystery of the cross and the meaning of redemptive suffering, as difficult as that is to embrace, that is where true power lies in the economy of God. And I think that's where we want to try to bring people to. And, suffering, I would say suffering is the gift nobody wants. Right. Because suffering, it teaches us obedience. It gives us perspective. It leads us to holiness, because all the illusions of what we think we can do by ourselves and what we think the world has to offer us, it all kind of dissipates when we're really suffering. And that brings us back to the primary reality in life, which is our relationship with God. And if you're having a hard time even getting out of bed in the morning, never mind what you think you're going to do in the afternoon, you're really brought back to that fundamental point, which is primary, that our relationship with God is the first thing in life.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing quite like being stripped down to nothing. Having suffered tremendously, I've shared with our listeners quite a bit when our son was brought into the world. It was extremely difficult, his entrance into the world, and nothing in that at that time, I couldn't understand that. It made no sense to me. In hindsight, it's become a lot clearer, but for many people, they don't get that hindsight in this life. I mean, it doesn't all come together in this beautiful fashion and make perfect sense in this life. But I think that's the right perspective. I mean, and like you said, it's the gift no one wants, but it's very, very difficult. So We're about to take a short break, but our last little segment here, I'm going to ask Father Peter to help us distinguish between, there's theological virtues, right? Faith, hope, and charity. And then there are the 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And they are not just titles of Beatles songs. So we'll be back after a short break, and we are going to, no break. Okay. So there are, I think, there's a lot of misinformation, I think, about these virtues and what they mean, especially all of them. But after a short break, we're going to ask Father Peter to distinguish what is the difference between the theological virtues and the 4 cardinal virtues, and what kind of a role do they play in our lives. We'll be back just after this.
Arm yourself for the daily spiritual battle. Visit St. Michael's Armory for beautiful sacramentals, recast antique metals and religious jewelry, and our exclusive sterling silver and wool brown scapulars. Take up these means to strengthen your soul and arm yourself well for the battle of life. stmichaelsarmory.com. That's stmichaelsarmory.com. Spiritual armor for the battle of life.
Catholic radio played a huge part in my life in helping me understand the faith. It was like one of the biggest things, and I still listen all the time. I have the bumper sticker on my viola case. People see it and, oh, Catholic radio. It's the best thing ever. It changed my life. Catholic radio is amazing. Please support Catholic radio. It's just an amazing resource. So much you can learn there, so much inspiration to actually live out your faith. It's just incredible. I love Catholic radio.
The Guadalupe Radio Network. Radio for your soul. Welcome back to A Life Lived Joyfully on the Guadalupe Radio Network. Give us a call. The lines are open at 877-757-9424. That's 877-757-9424.
Hey, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in with us today on this kind of dreary, but still beautiful Thursday in the Lenten season. We're here with Father Peter Marsalek with the Society of Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity, and we're talking about virtue, we're talking about suffering, and we are talking about how when you stand on a stool and say you're closer to the moon than your friend next to you, you're not much closer, are you? Father Peter was talking about suffering, and it's the gift no one wants, but it really does help us to grow in holiness. And after all, isn't that why we're listening to Catholic radio? Because we want to be holy. Well, you're already holy because you're listening to Guadalupe Radio Network, but you've got a story about suffering that you want to share.
Yeah, as you were talking, Sarah, I was, kind of reminded in my own life. My parents came from, communist country, Czechoslovakia, when they emigrated to Canada. And my mother's uncle was a Franciscan priest, and he was put in jail under the communist government with about 465 other priests and bishops accused of being Vatican spies. And he was in jail from 1950 to 1962 for 12 years and was made to suffer quite a bit while he was in the prison. And, I don't have any doubt that even my own vocation to the priesthood, in part was, I think, won or solidified by the graces he won through his suffering. And, kind of one way where that really kind of hit home to me is after communism ended, my uncle went back to the Franciscan community, and he was in a church in Prague called Our Lady of Snows, which you may remember the title comes from when in the year 358, Our Lady appeared to Pope Liberius and a Roman patrician asking that a basilica be built in her honor. And they asked, well, what would be the sign? And she said, well, there'll be a snowfall. And so on August 5th of that year, there was a snowfall, and that's where the Basilica of St. Mary Major was built. So I was in the Church of Our Lady of Snows with my mother and father some years back, and I was looking at the altar and kind of thinking of my uncle, who was a priest celebrating Mass there. And behind the altar, they have a relief which shows Mary up in the clouds, and she's pointing down at a snow-covered hill, which, of course, is where St. Mary Major was erected. And it only dawned on me at that moment that that is the exact place where I was ordained a priest, was at St. Mary Major in Rome, which for a kid coming from a suburb of Toronto, I never would have expected that. It was not part of the usual program, but you know, when I saw that, it really kind of just brought home to me the connection. You know, what he suffered, maybe even he didn't see in his own lifetime some of the fruit of his suffering and what he went through, but I am convinced in faith that I'm a beneficiary of what he went through. And I think that's kind of, you know, part of the gift of redemptive suffering. And we don't always even get to see the fruits ourselves, but in faith we know they're there, and if we're patient and if we persevere in it, good will come from it.
Now you're reminding me of, so I've shared on with our listeners before, but my late grandmother suffered for the last, 35 or 40 years of her life with a huge variety. She was exposed to a bunch of radiation. She's from Ireland, right? So she's exposed to all this radiation in her youth, and she, along with all of her siblings, suffered with, all of them had their thyroid essentially nuked, right? They all had multiple forms of cancer. I mean, it's this really, really serious illness throughout her whole life. And I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And at the end of her life, she said that she would gladly do it again if she knew that the graces won from the suffering she offered up would bring her children back to the church who are away from it. Like you said, right, the more you're stripped down, the more, if you're struggling just to get out of bed, like she did for many, many years, just in the morning, it puts things in an eternal perspective. And certainly that, those 12 years in prison, who could have imagined, right? Who could have imagined you'd be leading Our Lady Society towards, all these, anyway, it's really, really neat. And that's what we do here on the Guadalupe Radio Network. We talk about neat ways that God brings all these great things. So we only have a couple of minutes left. Can you use just a few minutes to sort of speak to how we distinguish or the two roles that the theological virtues and the four cardinal virtues play? You got a couple minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Well, the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, I think the important thing is they're rooted in God. They come and have their origin in God, and their object is God. And for that reason, you can always grow more in faith, hope, and charity because God is infinite. You can never believe too much, you can never hope too much, and you can never love too much. And indeed, we know from St. Paul, love is in fact what will endure, because that is our very participation in the divine life. So faith, hope, and charity really are God's gift to us that we receive through the gift of his grace, and that we are then able to practice. The cardinal virtues, prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice, all of those are really designed to kind of help us in our journey through life. Prudence is what we'd say right reason in action, to know concretely in the moment what is the decision I should make that will lead me toward heaven. Justice is whereby we give to the other what is due to them, and that would include God as well as other people. Temperance is really the moderation of our sensitive appetite, so the desires that we have to be able to moderate according to right reason, to say 1 scoop of ice cream, not the whole gallon, 1 glass of wine, not the whole bottle. And fortitude is that virtue whereby we persevere in the good which is difficult to do and the evil which is difficult to avoid. And fortitude kind of assists us to be able to accomplish that. And really the crowning act of fortitude is martyrdom, because the most difficult good to give up in a way is your own life. Yeah. And for that reason, martyrdom is kind of it has charity in its root, but it's the crowning act of fortitude.
Well, I will say there's something specifically about fortitude, giving us the strength to endure, right, trying circumstances. But it can be a test of faith too, right? I mean, if we are struggling immensely with something and we are given the opportunity to practice the virtue of fortitude, we could ideally come out on the other side with greater faith. And I mean, you can never believe too much, right? And so each of the virtues take practice, and you're not born like perfectly prudent, perfectly just, and those things. And I think, like you said, to all of our listeners here this Lenten season, you've got some big shoes to fill. If our Lord is the perfect embodiment, right, the perfect living out of each of the virtues, then we shouldn't look to our neighbor Shirley, who's very sweet, right? We shouldn't look to our best friend Hal. I mean, the reality is they can be virtuous, right? But they're always going to, like you said, fall short. And we got 2 minutes left. If you had some closing thoughts for our listeners about the virtues and about Well, I'll just take up all your time if I
But I think the perspective of virtue is an exciting way to really grow in our life, because we can use an examination of conscience to kind of pinpoint and say, what's an area of my life that I think I need to grow in? Mm-hmm. And wherever we perceive that weakness or imperfection to be, to then say, well, what is the corresponding virtue that I need to grow in? Mm-hmm. Even thinking of St. Paul's line, right, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. Mm-hmm. And if we have a weakness in life, it's going back to when I was teaching tennis. A lot of times people want to hide their weaknesses and just forget about them and shuffle them away. But really, we're called to identify them so we can improve them. And kind of virtue is a really good way to do that, because when we see the weakness and we say, okay, what is the corresponding virtue I need to grow in? When we know what that is, well, we can learn about it, we can pray about it, we can ask for God's help with it, and we can begin to practice it until we master it. And I think that's an important part of the Lenten journey.
Yeah. So you hear that, folks? No one's going to wave a magic wand over you this Lent and make you perfectly virtuous. You've got to practice it, but you can ask for God's help. And certainly find the areas in which you need to grow. Do you already know you're impatient? Great. You got a lot of work ahead of you. It's really remarkable what you can leave out in an hour and what you can really cover in an hour. So I apologize if we didn't get to cover the entire Catechism of the Catholic Church today. We can only do so much. We're only human. But I'm so grateful that you tuned in to listen to us today. And so if you want to hear more of Father Peter, he doesn't preach every single day and celebrate the Mass every single day, but at 7:30, Monday through Friday, Central Time, here on the Guadalupe Radio Network, Father Peter celebrates Mass. He's a member of the Society of Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity, and we are so deeply grateful for your time today. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Sarah. My pleasure.
And tune in to A Life Lived Joyfully every Monday through Friday, 4 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Eastern. We are so grateful for our listeners, and we are praying for you this Lent and all the time. God bless you.